My father crushed my dreams to protect the golden child and refused to pay for my tuition, but I got my sweet revenge. I have a younger brother 28, and we were raised by our dad 56, ever since we were in middle school. My dad has always favored my brother over me, and with time I got used to it. I was never the kind of son my dad wanted because, unlike him, I had no interest in sports or doing the typical macho things that boys do. I was always more into things that were considered more feminine, which is why I was a huge mama's boy growing up. I loved everything to do with the kitchen, reading books, and even singing. My dad tried to make me play football with him. My brother, on the other hand, was exactly the kind of son my father wanted. He was rough and tough, not afraid of getting dirty while playing or even getting hurt. He was the perfect son for my dad, and it was very obvious that he loved my brother way more than he loved me. He always had great things to say about my brother, but never me. My mother, however, never played favorites. She was fair to both of us, and that's why I loved her more as well. I did try to befriend my dad and spend time with him, but once we'd grown apart, he didn't seem keen on fixing our relationship. Unfortunately, the glue holding our messed up family together, my mother, passed away when I was in eighth grade. She'd been suffering from cancer, and by the time we realized it, it was too late for her to be saved. She was gone before we knew it. My mother's passing devastated me, and I kind of spiraled during that time. My only solace was the kitchen, and I'd whip up something new every day, as if my life depended on it. My mother was a great cook, and she'd often tell me that had she not been forced into taking over her dad's business, she probably would have become a chef. So cooking was the only thing that brought me comfort. Since my dad and brother were no help in dealing with my feelings, they suppressed any emotional reaction to my mother's passing. If anything, they grew even more distant from me when, in normal families, something like this would have brought us closer. My fixation on cooking pissed my dad off even more. He'd keep bugging me to get out of the kitchen and do something more manly. One day, when he'd had enough, he told me to be more like my brother and man up. He agreed to it. It was finally out in the open, and I guess it was pretty much the last day my father and I spoke so openly. After that I stopped trying to win him over altogether, and he didn't seem to care about it either. For the next few years I spent all the time I had in my room listening to music and studying new recipes. I was determined to make this whole chef thing work out, not just for myself, but also for my mother. Meanwhile, my dad and I only spoke when absolutely necessary. My brother didn't care about me much either and ignored me just like our dad did. So after my mom passed away, I basically had nobody I could count on. Finally, when it was time for me to apply to colleges, I decided to apply to a few of the top culinary schools as well as normal colleges so that I'd at least have a shot. I didn't know if my dad would agree to it, but I had to try. I'd already interned at a restaurant secretly that summer and had some experience. I even managed to get them to write a recommendation letter for me, which helped greatly. I ended up getting accepted into several of the schools I applied to, including one of the best, which just so happened to be in France. I was thrilled that this was finally happening for me, but I was equally nervous as this would mean having to ask my dad for permission. I'd already made up my mind to beg him to let me go if he seemed reluctant, because I just absolutely had to make this happen for myself. I wasn't prepared to give up on my dreams under any circumstances. So I did tell my father about it eventually. While I was ready for him to reject my request, saying that it wasn't a masculine profession, I was absolutely not prepared for him to decline paying my tuition at all. I still remember being really confused when he told me that he wouldn't be paying for my education at all. It wasn't as if my dad was poor in the slightest. As a matter of fact, he was pretty well off and could easily afford to send me to France. But money wasn't the reason he refused. It was the fact that if I went to France and joined such a reputable school, it would make my younger brother feel insecure. He was struggling with his grades and couldn't bring himself to focus, so my dad wanted me to either go to community college or find a way to pay for my own tuition. I was astonished that he would do something so cruel to his own son and didn't know what to say to him. I tried to tell him that I needed this, but he was hell-bent and absolutely unwilling to pay for my tuition. He even told me that my brother's well-being was his topmost priority, and that he didn't want me competing with his son. I could hardly believe this was happening. I couldn't imagine any other father in the world crushing their child's dreams like this just for their favorite. After a lot of pleading and sobbing, when he still refused to budge, I ended up getting into a huge fight with him. I started living with my maternal aunt, my mother's older sister, instead. The only reason I hadn't moved out earlier was that I found comfort in the house where I'd grown up with my mom, and also because I didn't want to change schools, which I'd have to do if I moved in with my aunt since she lived pretty far away from the high school I went to. I told her all about my dad and how he'd outright refused to pay my tuition, and that I needed her help. It felt horrible asking her for money since she wasn't as rich as my dad, but she reassured me that she'd take care of all my expenses. Somehow, she managed to get all her friends to pitch in and sent me to the culinary school of my dreams, and I'm always going to be grateful for that. Once I got there, I worked part-time as well and tried to make the most of my time there. I worked really hard and made my way up. When I graduated, I was one of the most skilled chefs there, and even got a job just a few months after I graduated. I started working at a really high-end French restaurant, and I sent half of my salary back to repay whatever debt I had. Slowly but steadily, I was just lucky that I didn't have to rely on a student loan, or maybe I'd never be able to pay any of it off. Anyway, I worked in France for a few years before finally moving back home once I'd saved up enough to open up my own restaurant. It's been a couple of years, and in the meantime, I worked at another restaurant here as the head chef, while also working toward my goal of opening up my own place. Finally, everything was finalized a few weeks ago, and I was able to open up the restaurant I'd been working toward for so long. Two of my friends from back when I was in France also joined in on my business idea and became co-owners with me, which is why I was grateful when they allowed me to choose what we were going to name the restaurant. They happened to be from the same state, so we were all okay with opening our restaurant in my city of choice as well. I chose to name it after my mother, which was a really lucky coincidence for us since my mother had a really beautiful and uncommon name in the city we called home. Everything was finally falling into place. A few days ago we even had a little party for a few select guests before we were officially open for business. Of course, I invited my aunt and a few of her friends who'd also pitched in to help pay for my tuition. I also invited some of my friends from school, but that was pretty much it. I didn't invite my father and brother because of obvious reasons. Even if I'd wanted to, I couldn't have since I hadn't spoken to them ever since I'd left home, and neither had they bothered to get back in touch with me. I guess all of us were better off this way, but I should have known they would definitely show up to piggyback on my success someday, and that's exactly what happened at the party. They showed up an hour before the party was due to begin, but weren't stopped by security since we shared the same last name. They claimed they were here to surprise me, and at least that bit was true. I was definitely surprised when I saw them. My dad and brother greeted me like nothing awful had ever happened in the past and were really warm towards me, probably for the first time in my entire life. I was shocked to see them, so I just froze when they first entered the restaurant. My friends noticed that something was off. I'm thankful they were able to pick up. I still hadn't recovered from the shock of seeing them again when they dropped another bomb on me and showed me a gift that they'd brought for me. It was a portrait of my mother, and my dad even told me that he commissioned it for me to hang up in my restaurant. As soon as he'd heard that a new fancy restaurant with this name was opening up in our city, he'd known that it was definitely none other than his son. He even told me that he'd always known I had it in me. My brother, too, was jumping on the bandwagon and praising me, telling me that he was immensely proud of me. I couldn't believe my ears and knew instantly that something was very strange about all of this. I didn't say much and kept waiting for them to get to the point because I knew there must have been a reason for them to be here. Eventually, they did get to the reason. Apparently, my brother was working as a bartender now, and even that was possible just because my dad had managed to convince a friend of his to give him a job at his club. My brother's grades had kept falling throughout high school and college, and that's why he didn't end up in the high-paying positions my dad had always expected from him. On top of that, he'd also been slacking during his high school football games, which is why he wasn't able to get a sports scholarship either. Ironically, he's the one. What they wanted me to do was make my brother a partner in the business so that he'd have a more respectable position, even though he had done absolutely nothing to deserve it. I had the urge to laugh in their face, but somehow managed to hold back and instead told them that I'd think about it. I wasn't going to think about it, though. I just didn't want to turn them away. I wanted them to stay for the party because I had a much better plan in mind to humiliate my family. They seemed reasonably pleased, but boy, they had no idea what was about to happen. A while later, our guests started arriving, and in about an hour, everyone we'd invited was there. I spent the evening socializing while my dad and brother did the same. I even heard them boasting about me to a few people. At the end of the party, it was time for the hosts, namely me and my partners, to give a toast. My friends went first since I wanted to save the best for last. Then, finally, it was my turn to speak. That day, I was finally going to speak my heart out. I started off by thanking all my guests and raised a drink to my mother first, since she was the reason I'd ever been able to achieve so much. I strongly believed that it was her faith in me as a child that had made me believe I could do all of this. That faith stayed with me even after she was gone. After I'd paid my respects, I decided to get to the real respect. I brought up how I'd had to take a loan from my aunt and her friends to go to culinary school, and thanked her as well. Then finally I got to the reason I had to take that loan in the first place, my family. I spoke about how I'd grown up with a father who never loved me, never had any faith in me, and always berated me for having feminine interests like cooking. I explained how my dad had refused to pay for my tuition out of fear that I'd end up becoming more successful than my younger brother who was his golden child. This is why I ended up leaving home. But despite all odds, I was able to rise and become who I am today. So in a way, this success was a testament to how little my family mattered in my journey. Of course, they both tried to interrupt me at that point, but I quickly told them to shut up. "I'm talking, you'll have your turn when I'm done," I said. Then I told them they should both be ashamed of how they had crushed my dreams just so they could protect my brother's ego. By the time I was done, my dad and brother had nothing to say. My dad just sat there like a lifeless shell of a man, and my brother didn't dare to speak a word. My friends, though, stood up to applaud me, and I took a bow. Then I ended the speech by raising my glass one last time and toasting to the fact that despite everything, my dreams came true, and that was all that mattered. So, my dear friends, the moral of the story is never let anyone crush your dreams, no matter who they are. After that speech, I could feel the weight lifting off my shoulders. The air in the room shifted. My family was silent, and the guests were not just applauding me, but were now looking at my father and brother with a certain judgment. It was as though, for the first time, I was finally standing in the light that I had fought so long to reach, and I could see their shame written all over their faces. My father, who had once towered over me with his expectations and criticisms, now seemed so small in comparison. I took a moment to enjoy the feeling of vindication, but it didn't last long. My dad's face was pale, his eyes fixed on the ground. My brother, who usually carried himself with such arrogance, seemed smaller too, his shoulders slumped, trying to hide his discomfort. Neither of them spoke a word as the applause died down, and the tension in the room was palpable. For the rest of the evening I didn't pay much attention to my father or brother. They seemed like ghosts in the background. The focus was on the restaurant, on the new beginnings I had worked so hard to create. My friends, my partners, and even the few familiar faces who had come to show their support were all smiles, eager to congratulate me on this monumental step. It was a strange contrast to the two men who had once been the center of my world, but now felt completely irrelevant to my present. As the night went on, my dad and brother quietly slipped away, clearly uncomfortable. I didn't chase after them. In fact, I didn't even feel the need to say goodbye. I knew that whatever words they had for me would just be hollow at this point. They had missed their chance long ago, and I had long since accepted that. There was no more space in my life for them, not after the way they treated me and undermined my dreams. I had survived, built my success, and it had come without their help. The next few days after the party were a whirlwind. The restaurant began to gain attention, as we had expected thanks to the grand opening event and the buzz surrounding its launch. Word of mouth spread quickly, and the reviews were overwhelmingly positive. I worked hard overseeing every detail of the kitchen, making sure that the food we served lived up to the expectations that my mother had instilled in me. I was meticulous about every dish, every flavor, making sure it was perfect, as I had always dreamed it would be. But as successful as the restaurant became, something gnawed at me. Despite the celebrations, despite the triumph, my father and brother had been absent from the most important moment of my life. I tried to tell myself that their absence was a relief, but deep down I couldn't completely shake the feeling of loss. I would often find myself standing in the kitchen late at night, when everything had quieted down, thinking about the man my father used to be before he was consumed by pride and a misguided need to favor my brother. I thought about my mother too, how she had been the only one who truly understood me, who had nurtured my passion for cooking. She had been the one who had always believed in me even when no one else did. In some ways it was her presence, not my father's or brother's, that still lingered in the kitchen. The smell of herbs and spices, the clink of pots and pans, and the way the fire in the stove crackled, it all reminded me of her. And then, of course, there was the pain of knowing that I had built this life on my own, but it had come at such a high price. The relationships that I had sacrificed, the moments I had missed, and the years of loneliness were a bitter undercurrent to the success I now enjoyed. I had made my way up through sheer willpower and determination, but there were days when I wished things had turned out differently. I wished my father had been proud of me, wished my brother hadn't been so threatened by my accomplishments. I wished that I hadn't had to prove myself to them at all. But the truth was I had done it. I had built my own empire, and I would never again allow myself to be defined by anyone else's expectations. I had spent too long trying to be someone I wasn't for the sake of others. Now, I was finally free to be myself, to pursue my dreams on my terms. I had earned this life. Over the next few months I continued to pour my heart into the restaurant. It became my sanctuary, my place of pride. As the head chef, I made sure everything was exactly how I had imagined it. The menu reflected my journey, my roots, my love for my mother, my personal struggles, and my unwavering belief in the power of food to heal. Every dish I prepared was a tribute to everything I had overcome, every challenge I had faced. I had learned not just how to cook, but how to create an experience, a story, through food. It was a reflection of who I had become. Business was booming. We attracted a loyal customer base, and soon even food critics and bloggers started taking notice. The restaurant became known not just for its food, but for its soul, something that couldn't be faked, something that came from years of hard work and dedication. It became a symbol of everything I had fought for, and more importantly, a testament to what it meant to truly follow your passion, no matter the odds. But despite the external success, I couldn't ignore the fact that my family's shadow still loomed over me. One afternoon, out of the blue, I received a letter from my father. It wasn't a phone call or an attempt to reach out in person, but a formal letter handwritten in his messy scrawl. It read, "I see what you've built. It's impressive, even if I don't fully understand it. You've become someone I don't recognize. But maybe that's a good thing. I'll admit I wasn't proud of you at first, but I see now that I was wrong. If you can find it in your heart, I'd like to meet again. Maybe we can talk. Maybe I can apologize for all the things I didn't say." It was strange. The words weren't exactly an apology, but they were close. It was an admission of guilt, a reluctant acknowledgement of his failure. Part of me wanted to respond, to finally confront him, but I didn't know if I was ready. Was I ready to forgive him for the years of hurt, for the blatant favoritism that had driven a wedge between us? Could I really allow myself to reconnect with him after everything that had happened? For days I went back and forth, torn between the person I had become and the person I used to be, the son who had desperately sought his father's approval. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do. Then, one evening, as I was preparing dinner for the staff and reflecting on everything, I realized something. My journey, my healing, wasn't about reconciling with my father or my brother. It was about forgiving myself, about finally accepting that I had done everything I needed to do on my own. If my father wanted to be a part of my life, I wasn't going to seek him out, but if he truly wanted to be a part of my world, he would have to meet me on my terms. And if not, I was fine with that too. So for the time being, I left the letter unanswered. I knew that whatever happened next, it wouldn't change the course I had set for myself. My restaurant was my legacy, and my story had already been written. In the end, the only thing that truly mattered was the journey I had taken to get here, the person I had become, not just in the kitchen, but in life. And I knew that no matter what my father or brother did, nothing could take away what I had built. Nothing could take away my dreams. Months passed, and the restaurant continued to thrive. It had become more than just a place where people came to eat. It had turned into a symbol of resilience, of following one's heart despite the odds. It was no longer just about food, it was about the experience, the journey of a person who had dared to defy expectations and carve a path that was uniquely their own. It became a haven for those seeking not just a meal, but a story, an escape, and a taste of something deeper. I had built something incredible, and I was proud of what I had accomplished, but the shadows of my family, once so overwhelming, had begun to fade. The letters from my father continued sporadically, each one more tentative than the last, but I never responded. There were no words that could undo the years of pain, no apologies that could fill the space between us. I had come to realize that reconciliation with him was no longer my responsibility. It was his journey to make, just as mine had been. Then, one day, just as the restaurant was about to close for the night, my brother walked through the door. It had been months since I last saw him, and seeing him now felt strange. There was something different about him, a weariness in his eyes that spoke volumes. He looked older, somehow more defeated, as though the weight of all that had happened had taken its toll. His presence filled the room with a quiet tension, but I didn't feel anger, just a deep sense of resignation. He sat at the bar, keeping his distance at first, unsure of how to approach me. The silence between us was thick, the years of bitterness and distance hanging like a fog in the air. Finally, he spoke. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low, hesitant, "about everything, about how I treated you and Dad." I didn't answer immediately. Part of me wanted to tell him how much I'd suffered, because of his actions, how I had spent years waiting for the love and support that never came. But I didn't. The words felt unnecessary now. Instead, I simply nodded. "I don't need an apology," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I've spent too long needing something from you that you couldn't give, but I've learned to live without it." He looked at me, his expression conflicted. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry for everything." I didn't respond. It was too late for words, too late for apologies that came after so much damage had already been done. I had long since stopped waiting for them. But I could see that he meant it. And in a way that was enough. We both understood that some things could never be fixed, but that didn't mean they had to define us forever. After a long pause my brother stood to leave. As he reached the door, he turned around almost as though he wanted to say more, but then he just nodded once. "Take care of yourself," he said, and then he was gone. I watched him leave, the weight of the moment settling on me. It was the first time I had truly felt a sense of closure with him, not because of the words he had spoken, but because of the understanding that had passed between us. We had both moved on in our own ways, and that was all we could do. There would be no reunion, no rebuilding of what was lost. But we could go on with our lives, each of us having found our own peace in the world. The next day I returned to the kitchen, the familiar sights and sounds of the restaurant comforting me as always. As I stood there chopping vegetables, stirring sauces, I felt a strange sense of fulfillment. I had finally made peace with my past, not with forgiveness, but with acceptance. The hurt was still there, but it no longer had the power to define me. I was my own person now, shaped by my experiences, but not bound by them. The restaurant was thriving, and more importantly, I had come to realize that the family I had built within its walls, my colleagues, my staff, and my loyal customers, was just as important as the one I had been born into. They were the ones who supported me, who believed in me, and who had helped me build the life I had always dreamed of. And then there was the food. It was still my greatest love, my true calling. Each dish I created was a reflection of my journey, of the triumphs, the losses, and the lessons I had learned along the way. The flavors, the textures, the combinations, they all told a story of perseverance, of reinvention, and of finding beauty even in the darkest of times. As I plated the final dish of the night and handed it to the waiter, I smiled to myself. This was it. This was the life I had built, and it was everything I had ever wanted. No longer was I defined by the disappointment of my father or the rivalry with my brother. I was defined by my own choices, my own hard work, and the love I had for what I did. I was finally free, and that was enough.